Regis Le Bris is more important than any player Sunderland have signed this transfer window. There, I have said it. And in this video, I'm going to break down why he could be our trump card in our first season back in the Premier League for nearly a decade. So I think the first place to start here is tactical fluidity. And the one thing that I love about Regis Le Bris since he's taken over at Sunderland is just the fact that he isn't married to like a specific style of play. There are like pillars that are always there, you know, the hard work, the trying to press in the final third, the using pace. You know, there are things that Sunderland do, as a standard because of the way the squad is built, but we aren't like married to like passing out the back every single game. We aren't married to, this is our way and this is what we're going to do no matter what happens and we're going to be stuck with it. You look at like Michael Carrick at Middlesbrough last season. Like they just were married to this style of play and fundamentally they've got a good team in it and it meant they finished in mid-table, and that's because they were so rigid in how they were trying to play. And Regis Le Bris is not that. And that is a massive win because you look at recent teams in the Premier League. Look at Southampton last season. Even look at like Kieran McKenna and Ipswich. They all play with like the same sort of style where they try and pass out all the time. They try and build from the back. And Le Bris, I don't think, is naive enough to even try and implement that. I'm not saying he wouldn't do that in individual games, but I think we've seen on the evidence of him being Sunderland manager that he is very, very fluid in how he tries to approach games. And I think you can see that in how Sunderland ended the season. So obviously, there was that run of like 5 or 6 defeats. I can't remember how many it was now, but a few defeats in a row at the end of the season. Everyone was panicking, but it was obvious that there was a plan there. And he didn't, basically flog the players and make them work hard to win essentially meaningless games towards the end of the season. And look, it drove the fan base insane. It drove me, quite insane as a fan, being like, God, we're not going to be ready for the playoffs. But ultimately, it was a tactic that sort of played off. And we saw that in the playoffs, that Sunderland had a style. They went to Coventry and they thought, right, we're going to frustrate them. Frank Lampard's team like to pass the ball around. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and nick it and break on them. And that gave us 2 goals. Yes, obviously there was the fortunate Van Erwijk mistake, but we pushed that mistake because we pressed them into it. And I think that we'll see that a lot from Le Bris. He'll look at games and think, right, well, how do we win this game? We even saw it in the playoff semi-final second leg where the expectation, I think, from most people was that Sunderland would try and go out and blow Coventry away, and they did sort of try and do that in the first 20 minutes, but after that he was okay settling into a low block and trying to frustrate Coventry. And look, we all know how that game played out. I don't know if Le Bris actually got that one tactically spot on, but Sunderland did win the game. They were the better team in extra time. They had the energy in extra time, but if Haji Wright scores that header later on, maybe we're talking about something very different. But fundamentally, I think that Le Bris still deserves credit for sticking to what he thought was going to be the way to win Sunderland the game, and ultimately Sunderland did win the game. We then get to the playoff final, and, again, we saw that Le Bris changed the game in the second half, and he was tactically able to go, right, this wasn't working, let's change it around. He did that, and Sunderland ended up winning the game late on, and that was a theme at the end of the season. Sunderland had fresh legs towards the end of games, and maybe that is something we'll see this season, reminiscent of that first Roy Keane season in the Premier League, that Sunderland will be, winning games late on and having that energy late on, because I think that that's a way you can pick up points in the Premier League. If you're fitter than the other team, which is hard to do at this level, but you can pick up points late on in games, and be a threat in that way. And I think as well, you have to look at how Le Bris tackled like big games last season. Like Middlesbrough at home always sticks out of my mind, where he was willing to let Middlesbrough have a lot of the ball, and it was weird as a home game where you could see sort of even at the start of the game that Middlesbrough basically stopped the game because they were waiting for the Sunderland press, but Sunderland were like, no, just have the ball. We don't need the ball, you have the ball. And I think you see that, it's quite rare that managers will look at home games in derby games, in big games, and be able to implement that sort of style, and it worked. And Middlesbrough had no idea how to deal with Sunderland that day because we were hurting them so much in transition, but they was just so like, we're going to dominate the ball. The best thing for them to do would have been to try and give us the ball, but managers don't do that. They're like, no, I want to play with the ball. And then at the end of the game, they'll go on a press conference and say, God, we dominated the ball today, and, we had X, Y, and Z, but they didn't test the goalkeeper and they didn't have any shots. So, we saw that with Coventry as well in the playoffs. Not a lot of shots on target, but everyone was talking about the domination. And I think we'll see that a lot from Sunderland this season, the ability to come up with a game plan. And we saw that when they played Burnley, particularly the away game at Burnley. There was a masterful plan there. Sunderland should have won that game, didn't. Missed a couple of penalties. James Trafford had, probably the best game of his whole career. That's by the by. Fundamentally, Sunderland came into that game and they were the better team. And I think we've seen a lot just in them games that Le Bris had a plan. And that is something that fills me with a lot of confidence, is that there is seemingly going a plan for all these big games. And I think in the Premier League, one thing that you do have is time. There's 38 games instead of 46. There's not many midweek games. There's a lot more time to plan for games. And that is something that Le Bris can take like a 1%, 2%, 3% gain on, because I don't think there's going to be many managers better than him at getting a team ready for a game of football. And I also think because of the position Sunderland are in, being seen as one of the weaker teams in the Premier League, we don't know if they necessarily will be, but they'll be seen as that. I don't necessarily know if managers will come up with a plan for Sunderland, but we can plan for them because we'll know how they want to tackle the game. Most teams will want to dominate the ball. Most teams will look at Sunderland as a weaker team, so therefore can dominate the ball. And Le Bris is the perfect manager, really, to counteract that. And I think that it's exciting that we've got a manager here who isn't going to try and dominate games with the ball, because that's not going to be how we win games. I look at like Leeds, for example, and I think Leeds have done some good business. I fancy their chances to stay up this season. But the one question mark they have is their manager, because Daniel Farke is, it feels to me like, married to a certain style of play, and that's a style of play which works when you are the better team. But Leeds have went from being the biggest resource team in the Championship with the best players to now being a bottom end team. So how does Daniel Farke change his style? Can he change his style? I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. I don't know. But I think that is something Sunderland have. They have a manager who is willing to change. He's not married to playing in a certain way. And that is only going to be a positive from now to the end of the Premier League season. And I think another point is the calmness of Le Bris. If you've got a manager, for example, like Russell Martin, and I've dragged on Russell Martin a couple of times here, but Russell Martin, I saw a clip of him last week. Rangers drew on the opening day of the season, and he threw the players under the bus after one game. And that shows his emotion and whatnot. But them players in that dressing room can't have been happy that after day one, the manager is basically selling out these players and sort of putting a lot on them. Le Bris is not going to do that. He is calm no matter what happens. If Sunderland win a game, if Sunderland draw a game, if Sunderland lose a game, Le Bris' demeanour largely stays the same. He's never too high, he's never too low, and that is a massive positive for us. And also in a season where you are likely to lose more games than you win, having a manager who is calm is very assuring for a fan base. And I think puts Sunderland in very, very good stead that they've got such a level-headed manager. And I think it's really important, because if you've got a manager who's really up and down, that can really pull the fan base up and down. And I think we know Sunderland have got such a passionate fan base that having somebody who's level-headed in charge can really, really help, because this is such a huge football club. What can happen is if there are negative things happening and then you've got the manager who's not helping that situation, not feeding an air of calmness, it can just snowball very, very quickly. So I think having a calm manager for Sunderland in the Premier League in a season where they're not likely to win, they might win 10, 11 games and they might lose 15, 16 games. That's going to be really, really important down the stretch where we do have an awful look in December where we might lose a few games in a row. We've got the AFCON in January where it looks like half of our squad isn't going to be there. So there are reasons to think that his calmness and his demeanour will be an advantage for Sunderland over having someone like a Russell Martin who is very publicly out there in what he's feeling and will react to a game with rawness, which doesn't necessarily help your situation. So I think overall the three sort of pillars of what I've discussed there are the tactical side of things. Le Bris is tactically fluid and will approach games with a plan for each individual team. You'll have time to implement that plan as well. You don't have that Saturday, Tuesday. You've got a week to prepare for pretty much every game, and that will hold Sunderland in really, really good stead. I think as well, we just talked about the calmness. That's a massive plus for Sunderland. And I think that there's a chance for Sunderland to really thrive this season by having somebody like Le Bris in charge. And I said at the start of the video, I think he's the most important signing. And even though, I know he's signed a new deal, but he's the most important thing over every signing. I know Granit Xhaka is obviously a huge bit of business, but this is a manager who I think is built to be a Premier League manager in terms of his tactical intuition in terms of how he sets teams up, it's a massive positive to have somebody like that and not somebody who's a philosophy manager, somebody who's married to this is the way we play, that's what we're going to do, don't care who we're playing, that's how we're going to play. And I think that's in the Premier League, unless you've got one of the best teams, that's really, really hard to do, because you're basically saying that our tactics are better than your tactics, we're going to do that. Whereas the actual best way of doing things is going, right, this is your tactic, here's our tactic to try and, you know, beat your tactic. If you've got a weak left side or you do things that we can hurt, then we'll do that. Whereas if you're married to a certain style, you're not going to do that. And I think that ultimately, to tie this up in a nice bow, I think Le Bris is Sunderland's ace this season. I think Sky won't love him, you know, and the TV companies won't love him because he is probably seen as boring. But Sunderland could do with that. They need a thoughtful manager who thinks things through in every single game to get us, you know, a win. And he's going to do, in my opinion, very, very well this season. And even if Sunderland get relegated, I think Le Bris is going to come out this season with flying colours, and hopefully he'd be here to lead a charge up. But I think Sunderland, provided they can get the centre-back through the door, you know, and that's a thing that I think they will do. But as every day passes on, it gets more nervy. But as long as Sunderland can get that defender through the door, they've got every chance of thriving in the Premier League this season. So anyway, thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. We'll catch you for the next one.